Great, thank you. Obviously, it's a massive issue, a massive topic, so please do, if I say anything that you're not sure about or you have questions, then jot it down as I'm speaking, and there'll be time later on to deal with those questions. I'm really aware that this kind of topic throws up lots of questions, so please do that. I want to start by telling you about a girl called Christina Green, who was born on September 11th, 2001, that tragic day. Now, she was one of 50 babies born on 9/11. And she was pictured in a book called Faces of Hope. And the author, who had 50 babies, one of whom was Christina Green, introduced the book by saying this: "A baby does not have to be yours for you to be able to see the promise of the future in its face. I hope, whoever you are, however September 11th, 2001 touched you, that you'll be able to see the hope in the faces of these babies. I hope it will remind you that everything will be okay." Of course, that's such a natural reaction to such a horrible event, isn't it? The thought that it can't get worse than this, that one day things will be better. And these babies were the promise of a better future. Well, 9 years later, on January the 8th, 2011, Christina Green was with her parents and they were attending a political rally in Arizona. She was shot and she was killed. She was only 9 years old. She was meant to be a face of hope that promised everything will be okay. And instead, she's just a face of despair, isn't she? That this world is cruel, it seems unjust, and it is full of painful suffering. And I think for many, that is the deal breaker when it comes to believing in a God. They hear that God is described as being all-loving and all-powerful, and yet they look at the world around them and it doesn't seem to fit that kind of God. Sam Harris, a journalist in the States, wrote a short book called A Letter to a Christian Nation. And he was trying to persuade American Christians to stop believing in God. And at one point he writes this: "If God exists, either he can do nothing to stop the most wicked calamities, or he does not care to. God, therefore, is either powerless or evil. There is another possibility, of course. The biblical God is fiction." If God stands by while Christina Green is shot and killed, then either he is unable to intervene or he is unwilling to intervene. Or perhaps simply he's just not there. And before going on, I want to recognise that while for some people in this room, this whole area of suffering in God is an intellectual concern, it's a question: how can there be a God in a world of suffering? And yet for others in this room, I'm sure suffering is incredibly real to you right now. And so as we go forward, I hope to try and address some of that intellectual question, but I also hope to address some of that emotional issue as well. Now, okay, look, one response to the problem of suffering then is to agree with Sam Harris and to say there is no God. But I want to suggest that throws up problems of its own. And that's our first point, actually. Suffering doesn't make sense without God. See, if we say there is no God, then it seems to me that it's very hard to make sense of suffering in our world, or at least make sense of our response to suffering in our world. Let me try and explain that. There's something in each of us, isn't there, which recoils in the face of suffering. Our instinct reaction is to say that suffering is wrong. It's more than we just don't like it. We say it is wrong. It shouldn't be the case that a baby dies at 6 weeks from cot death. It shouldn't be the case that earthquakes and tsunamis and natural disasters claim thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. There is something wrong in the world when those things happen. But you see, if there is no God, on what grounds can I say those things are objectively wrong? If all there is are the blind forces of natural selection and survival of the fittest, then you could argue, couldn't you, the weak dying due to illness or disease, or the strong overcoming the weak through violence and murder, it is exactly what we should expect. It's not wrong when those things happen. The world is acting as it should. Listen to the biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins talk about our world and the suffering in it. He says, "If the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies are exactly what we should expect." So if you take God out of the picture, if the universe is nothing more than matter, motion, time and chance, then suffering is exactly what we should expect. It's normal. It's natural. Neither good nor bad. But the trouble is, it does not feel that way, does it? In the face of suffering, every fibre of our being says it shouldn't be like this. When my auntie was diagnosed with a terminal illness, she didn't think, oh, this is fitting, this is just the natural outworking of matter, motion, time and chance. And her thoughts were, I must fight this. It's not right. It's not how things should be. This last month has seen a number of famous and well-loved people die of cancer. David Bowie, Alan Rickman, Terry Wogan. And the journalist Hugo Rifkind tweeted in response, and he said about cancer, don't just be sad, be angry. When the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas watched his father die, he wrote perhaps one of his most famous poems. And listen to the opening verse, do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. What's our reaction to suffering? We rage against it. We instinctively know that it's wrong and it's evil and it is to be fought against. But without God, it's hard to explain that reaction. Now, please don't mishear me. I'm not saying that the atheist doesn't weep and rage against suffering. I'm not saying that the atheist is indifferent to suffering. I'm saying the exact opposite. When faced with the death of someone we love, theist or atheist, we react the same way. We hate it. We know that it's wrong. My point is simply this. Is that reaction consistent with an atheistic worldview? And if I drop a plate and it falls to the ground and it smashes, well, I don't get angry at gravity. I may not like it, but I don't get angry at gravity. Gravity's just doing what it does. If someone close to me dies tragically young, oh, I get angry then. It shouldn't be that way. If there is no God, then death, suffering, illness, they aren't wrong things. They aren't evil things that we should rage against. They are just natural and meaningless tragedies, outworkings of the universe composed of nothing more than matter, motion, time and chance. You see, I don't think suffering, or at least our reaction to it, makes sense in a worldview that hasn't got God in the picture. So let's bring God back into the picture, and you begin to see that our reaction to suffering does make sense. If I want to be able to say that suffering is unnatural and wrong and evil, then I must have in mind some objective standard of good and bad that the world is either not reaching or is reaching. But where has that sense of objective good and evil come from? Well, the Christian claim is that it has come from God. That God created the world good. He created us with a sense of how the world should be, with a sense of what is right and good and fair. And when we see the opposite to those things, when we see suffering, we know that deep down that it's wrong. We know deep down that it isn't the way things should be. And so here's the thing. If you take God out of the picture, how do you explain our reaction to suffering? How do you explain our sense that suffering is evil and wrong if you take a God out of the picture who gives us the standard of what good and bad is? So that's kind of our first point, really. Without God, suffering and our response to it doesn't seem to make sense. So let's just consider the alternative view then, that God does exist. But then surely that presents itself with all sorts of problems, doesn't it? If God exists and there is suffering in the world, it means that this God, even if he is there, can't be a God worth knowing. There was a drama series on BBC One ages ago called Silk, and it was about a barrister called Martha Costello. During the series, she experienced some incredible sadnesses, including the loss of her baby. And as a barrister defending different people, she saw all this other kind of horrible stuff going on in people's lives. And in one episode, she's standing outside a church, and another character says to her, "Martha, do you believe in God?" And she replied, "No. And even if I did, I wouldn't like him." She was thinking back over all the tragedy she'd experienced and seen and thought, if there is a God, and he's let all of this happen, he can't be a God worth knowing. Surely the presence of suffering means there may be a God, but he does nothing to stop suffering, then he's not a God worth knowing. That leads to the second point. I want to suggest one reason among many that you could put forward as to why God might allow suffering. And that's this, that suffering tells us something is wrong. So the suffering we face points us to a deeper problem. The claim of Christianity is that we were made for a relationship with our God who made us, our Creator. He is the one who is the source of all life, of all joy, of all peace. But our relationship with our Creator is broken. And that breakdown in relationship has massive and profound implications for our lives and this world. It means that we, as people, are fundamentally broken. Instead of being outward orientated towards loving God and loving others, we are inward orientated. We end up loving ourselves more than we love others. We care, it seems to me, more about our own happiness and freedom than we do about the well-being of others. And so we don't treat people right. We use others, we hurt others, we cause suffering. Small-scale friendships, big-scale war. And so one of the reasons I think that God allows suffering to continue in our world is because it points to a deeper problem. It reminds us that all is not right with us and our world because all is not right in our relationship with our Creator. The writer C.S. Lewis put it like this: God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts in our pains. Suffering is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And you know, so often in my experience, not always, but that has been the effect of suffering. A friend who's not a believer, not a Christian, was diagnosed last year with cancer, and her response was to make her think, there must be more to life than this. She turned to God. Take, for example, one of the worst events in modern history, the Nazi concentration camps. And yet, even there, people turned to God rather than away from him. Viktor Frankl, one of the survivors, described life in the camp, and he wrote, "The depth and vigour of religious belief often surprised and moved the new arrival. There were improvised prayer services in the corner of a hut or in the darkness of the locked cattle truck in which we brought back from a distant works." So what I'm trying to say is, can you see that the effect that suffering can have? It can wake people up to the fact that there is something wrong with us and this world because there is something wrong with our relationship with God. Okay, maybe God exists. Maybe it's logically possible for all-loving God and all-powerful God to have reasons to let suffering continue. But I don't care about the logic of it all. I care about what's happening to me now. What is God going to do about the pain that I'm feeling right now? Or thirdly, suffering is overcome by Jesus. When I was growing up, I had a close friend who in many ways was very different to me. I was brought up in a kind of a middle-class home, never went without. She struggled with money, struggled with her parents. They broke up very young, and life was difficult for her. By the time she was 18, she had a young baby, she was living on her own, and she was trying to work to earn money. And I remember going around to see her, and I said something stupid like, "I know how hard it must be for you right now." And she said back, rightly, "What would you know?" And it's easy to think similarly about God, isn't it? As we suffer down here, he's pain-free up there. What does he know about suffering? Well, the unique and wonderful message of Christianity is that God did not stay up there. He came down here into our world in the person of Jesus, and he suffered. 2,000 years ago, the historical figure of Jesus lived on this world, and he did things and said things that only God could do. He was God in flesh. And in just 33 years, Jesus Christ, God, experienced some of the worst kind of suffering. Poverty, genocide, bereavement, abandonment, rejection, beatings, betrayal, loneliness. The Christian God is not ignorant about suffering. He understands even more than we do what it is to suffer. Whatever we're going through, God has been through and worse. In our suffering, he can say to us, I understand. But more than that, after 33 years, Jesus died a terrible death on the cross. And through his death, Jesus begins to deal with the problem behind suffering. The root cause of all suffering. Remember I said earlier, we're broken, and our world is broken because our relationship with God is broken. Through his death, Jesus is able to restore that relationship back to God. He deals with the root cause of all suffering. And that means he cares. Do you see how much he cares? He cares so much about us and our suffering that he dies to deal with it. And finally, Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose again and was seen physically alive by countless eyewitnesses. And in overcoming death, Jesus shows us that God has the power to end all suffering. Death and suffering could not keep its hold on Jesus. During the Balkans conflict, a cellist called Vedran Smailovic was living in Sarajevo. And on the 26th of May 1992, 22 people were in this queue for bread, and a bomb exploded and killed them all. In response, Vedran Smailovic took his cello and he played it in the bomb crater for 22 consecutive days as a memorial. There was such a powerful contrast between how the world was, the rubble and destruction of the bomb crater, and how the world should be, the beautiful and peace-bringing and tranquility-bringing sound of the music he was playing. See, Jesus' resurrection from the dead serves as an incredible contrast of how the world is broken by suffering and how the world will one day be. His resurrection is the beautiful music in the bomb crater. It's the promise and proof that death and suffering will not win in the end. But more than that, it's the promise and proof that anyone who wants it can be brought into that pain-free world by Jesus. So where does that leave us? What do I say to my friend whose baby died at just 6 weeks from hot death? Why did God allow that to happen? What do I say to my friend whose body is twisted and contorted and painful because of cerebral palsy? Why has God allowed that to happen? Well, to be honest, I don't think I can say why. Not in those specific cases. And actually, in the midst of suffering, I doubt any kind of reason will really help at that moment. But what I can say is this: it's not because God doesn't love you. In the life of Jesus, we see that God understands. He has experienced the suffering we've been through. In the life of Jesus, we see that God cares so much that he died to deal with the root cause of all suffering. And in the life and the resurrection of Jesus, we see the wonderful hope that suffering can come to an end through Jesus.